A cold wind cuts across the Jelenia salient on the evening of the 3rd of September 1941. Lieutenant Hans Brandt presses his eye to the sight of a 37mm anti-tank gun dug into a hedgerow, watching a tree line 400 metres away where Soviet armour was reported moving an hour before. He counted 3 T-34s crossing open ground at dusk. Now he counts none. The light is fading to a bruised grey, and where steel should catch the last sun, he sees only broken shadow, a smear of green and brown that could be scrub, could be stone, could be nothing at all. Brandt lowers his binoculars and curses under his breath. Somewhere out there, 30 tons of Soviet steel sit motionless less than half a kilometre from his position, and he cannot find them. He does not know it yet, but the paint drying on those holes, mixed by hand that same week in a factory workshop 600 kilometres to the east, will cost his division more than any weapon the Red Army has yet put into the field. To understand why a tin of paint could unsettle a trained German gunner, one has to understand the disaster the Soviet Union was living through that autumn. By early September 1941, German forces had advanced over 500 kilometres into Soviet territory in under 3 months. Kiev was about to fall, encircling nearly 650,000 Red Army soldiers. Factories that had built tanks in Kharkov, Leningrad and Moscow were being dismantled bolt by bolt and loaded onto flat cars, part of an evacuation that would eventually move over 1,500 industrial enterprises beyond the Ural Mountains between July and November 1941. The Kharkov locomotive factory, chief producer of the T-34, was relocated to Nizhny Tagil, where it would be reborn as the Ural Tank Factory, later nicknamed Tankergrad. Speed mattered more than polish. A T-34 in 1941 took roughly 100,000 man-hours to build. By 1943, that figure had been driven down to under 8,000 as factories cut every non-essential process. Camouflage paint, remarkably, was not cut. On the 7th of August 1941, the Council of People's Commissars issued Order Number 5667, instructing the People's Commissariat of Chemical Production to divert budget earmarked for standard olive paint towards 2 new pigments, designated 6K and 7K, and to ship them to every armour-producing factory, along with a document called Instructions for Camouflage Painting. The order came from men who understood that with air reconnaissance and long-range optics improving on both sides, a tank that could not be seen was worth more than a tank with slightly thicker armour. The paint itself was unglamorous almost to the point of absurdity. The base colour, 4BO, had been developed in 1937 and standardised for Red Army vehicles by 1940, a protective green mixed as a thick paste of roughly 40 to 60% yellow ochre, 15 to 20% zinc chromate, and the remainder ultramarine and white, thinned with linseed oil before application. It was not a single consistent shade. Factories mixed it from whatever raw pigment stock they had on hand, so a T-34 rolling off the line at Chelyabinsk in December might carry a noticeably different green from one built at Gorky in June. On top of this base, workers applied a disruptive pattern using 6K, a dark brown-black, and 7K, a grey-yellow described in factory documents as sand yellow. The scheme, drafted that spring by military engineer 3rd Class F.F. Kolosov and approved by Major General I.P. Galitsky in May 1941, covered roughly 60% of a vehicle's surface in 4BO, with 6K taking up around 20% in irregular blotches and 7K filling the remainder. The goal was not to hide the tank entirely, but to break its silhouette, to stop the eye and the rangefinder from registering 30 tons of metal as a single continuous shape. Kolosov's team had studied how the human eye passes a battlefield at range, and they built a pattern designed to fragment recognition rather than achieve invisibility in the literal sense. Applying it, however, was another matter entirely, and this is where the story stops being about chemistry and becomes about improvisation under siege conditions. At the Ghazi factory in Gorky, camouflage was applied with genuine rigour. Along with the nearby factory number 92, which built ZS-30 tank destroyers, Gaz painted the full three-colour scheme onto essentially every vehicle it produced in the second half of 1941. Elsewhere, the picture was chaotic. Many factories received the pigments and the instructions, but simply did not have the labour or the time to apply intricate patterns to tanks that needed to reach the front within days of assembly. At some plants, tank crews themselves took up brushes and mops once the vehicles reached forward depots, working from memory or a printed diagram pinned to a workshop wall. Soviet tankers were not issued dedicated camouflage kits, so paint was frequently mixed on site and applied with whatever tools could be found, a mop and a bucket being common enough that period accounts mention them specifically. One camouflage variant tested at the Gyabtu Proving Grounds in September and October 1941 covered 60 to 70% of a tank in white, leaving green patches overlaid with a fine grid of thin white lines. It was found to work well at distance, where the grid blurred the eye's ability to separate green from white, and it proved especially effective in winter urban fighting around towns like Kalinin and Klin. It was also brutally impractical. Painting a single tank this way, including the necessary surface cleaning beforehand, took 6 to 8 hours, and since tanks caked themselves in mud and soot within days of combat, the elaborate pattern rarely survived long enough to justify the labour. By 1942, it had largely fallen out of use in favour of simpler schemes. If this deep dive into history is holding your attention, a quick subscribe helps more than you might think. Winter brought its own answer, and it was almost embarrassingly simple. Once snow settled across the front from November onwards, crews mixed chalk, lime or whiting into water to produce a washable white coating that could be slapped over the 4BO base and, crucially, scrubbed off again when the thaw came. This was not a factory product. It was field expedient, often applied with brooms, rags, even bare hands, and it varied wildly in coverage and thickness from unit to unit. Some crews painted their hulls solid white, others left irregular streaks of green showing through, mimicking the patchy half-melted snow that actually covered the ground, which proved more effective than uniform white against the mottled winter landscape around Moscow during the Soviet counteroffensive that began on December 5, 1941. German after-action reports from that winter repeatedly note difficulty distinguishing stationary Soviet armour from terrain at ranges beyond 300 metres, particularly at dawn and dusk when contrast was already low. It is worth noting the contrast with German practice at the same moment. The Wehrmacht, caught without proper winter camouflage stocks as the campaign dragged past its planned autumn conclusion, was reduced to painting vehicles with whatever whitewash quartermasters could scrounge locally, often applied far more crudely and inconsistently than the deliberately rehearsed Soviet field procedures. For infantry and reconnaissance units on both sides, the practical effect of Soviet camouflage discipline showed up in small, repeated frustrations rather than dramatic reversals. German forward observers assigned to call in artillery on massed Soviet armour found their target identification slowed, sometimes by minutes that mattered when a T-34 company was closing at speed. Panzer crews reported losing visual contact with camouflaged T-34s in mixed woodland and open steppe alike, particularly during the low, slanting light of early morning and late afternoon that dominates so much of the Eastern Front's daylight hours for half the year. Soviet tank crews, for their part, treated the paintwork with a mixture of pride and fatalism. Interviews collected after the war, including those gathered for the well-known oral history, T-34 in action, described tankers who barely thought about camouflage at all once combat began, focused instead on keeping the engine running and the gun loaded, treating the vehicle itself as expendable machinery rather than something to be preserved through subtlety. That attitude extended to maintenance generally. Crews were known to stuff quarter-inch gaps between armour plates with cloth to block drafts rather than requisition proper seals. The same pragmatic make-do approach that produced the camouflage scheme in the first place. The occupying and advancing German forces, meanwhile, developed their own countermeasures, training spotters to look for the geometric regularity of tracks, hull shadow beneath the vehicle, and the glint of optics and hatch hinges that no paint scheme could disguise, evidence that the camouflage bought time and reduced probability of detection rather than granting true invisibility. The unexpected complication came from production itself, and it is a very Soviet kind of problem. As factories scaled output to extraordinary levels, over 11,000 T-34s built in 1942, alone rising toward annual figures well above that as Tankergrad and its sister plants hit their stride, the sheer variability in pigment supply meant that the promised standard was never actually achieved. Factories at Chelyabinsk, Nizhny Tagil, Gorky, and Omsk each drew on local pigment sources of varying purity, so 4BO paste mixed in the Urals in winter. 1942 could differ visibly from the same designation mixed at Gorky the previous summer, ranging from a yellowish olive to something closer to a dull, dark khaki. Rather than correcting this, the system essentially absorbed it. By 1943,
factories were increasingly authorized to basecoat vehicles in whatever green stock they had available, abandoning the elaborate three-color disruptive pattern almost entirely in favor of a flat, single-color finish. The elaborate pattern designed by Kolosov's team in the optimism of early 1941, with its careful 60-20-20 split between 4BO, 6K, and 7K, simply could not survive contact with a production system building tens of thousands of vehicles a year under wartime pressure. What had begun as a scientifically considered disruptive scheme evolved through sheer industrial necessity into something closer to a monotone, and it turned out this simplification cost remarkably little in practical effectiveness, since distance, weather, and battlefield grime did more to obscure a tank's outline than any painted pattern ever could. The turning point, if the story has one, is not a single battle, but a shift in Soviet doctrine that the camouflage program helped enable. Once commanders understood that a stationary or dug-in tank was genuinely difficult to spot from typical engagement ranges, tactics began to favor ambush positions, hull-down firing lines, and ground that let armor hide until the moment it opened fire, methods that would define Soviet tank doctrine for the rest of the war. Field manuals issued through 1942 and 1943 increasingly instructed crews to select firing positions using natural terrain features in combination with the vehicle's own paintwork, rather than relying on paint alone. This is visible in how Red Army armored formations were employed at Kursk in July 1943, where dug-in and camouflaged T-34s and self-propelled guns absorbed the initial German assault from concealed positions before counterattacking, a tactic that depended on the enemy struggling to locate armor before it chose to reveal itself. The paint had not made tanks invisible in any literal sense, but it had bought the seconds and meters that separated a successful ambush from a wasted one, and Soviet commanders built their tactics around that margin. In the weeks and months that followed any given engagement, the practical legacy of the program showed up less in headlines than in equipment manuals and captured vehicle reports. American and British technical teams who examined captured or Lend-Lease adjacent Soviet vehicles, including the T-3476 and KV-1 tested at Aberdeen Proving Ground in the United States in 1942, catalogued the paint formulations in detail, curious about a coating that Western observers considered crude by comparison with their own, more standardized schemes, yet which performed adequately in the field. German intelligence assessments from 1942 onward routinely flagged Soviet camouflage discipline as a contributing factor in underestimated tank concentrations, feeding into the broader, costly pattern of German commanders repeatedly misjudging the scale of Soviet armored reserves before major offensives. By the war's final years, the Soviet approach, cheap, inconsistent, produced under desperate industrial pressure, had nonetheless outlasted the more elaborate German and even some Western camouflage doctrines, partly because its very simplicity made it something any factory, anywhere, with almost any pigment stock, could replicate close enough to specification to matter. The post-war Warsaw-Pact green that generations of military modelers now associate with Soviet armor is, in fact, a later standardization of exactly this wartime improvisation, a color born less from a laboratory than from a nation building tanks faster than it could keep the paint consistent. Back at Yelnya, had Lieutenant Brandt lived to see the following winter, he would have watched the same trick play out again and again, T-34s dissolving into hedgerows and snowfields with a paint job mixed days earlier by hands more concerned with speed than precision. There was no secret formula, no chemical marvel, nothing a modern laboratory would recognize as sophisticated. There was ochre, chromate, ultramarine, and linseed oil, mixed inconsistently in a dozen relocated factories by workers who had, months earlier, been building tractors and locomotives rather than weapons of war. What made it work was not the paint itself, but the desperation and improvisation behind it, a willingness to issue instructions faster than they could be perfected, to let 60% solutions reach the front rather than wait for 100% one that never would. Somewhere along a tree line in September 1941, a green so ordinary it barely deserved the name, became one more reason the advance that was meant to end before winter never did,